Prratek. So a little bit about him. He is an engineering manager at Vox Media. He and his data team serve that wasn't my phone. Serve an audience of 100 million people. And a fun fact about him is that he was an early adopter of the metrics package, which is a component of the semantic layer that you all just saw in the keynote. And we wouldn't be where we are today without some of his help. So if you are interested in communicating with the online community and asking questions there, please go to the Coalesce Outgrowing a Single DBT Slack channel. And with that being said, let's welcome him up.
All right, let's make sure this mic thing works. That sounds fine to me. Okay, I'm really psyched about this. I'm hoping all of you are as well. As some of you noticed when I was taking a selfie at the start, I haven't spoken at a conference before, so doing this here with all of you, both in person and virtual, is honestly pretty special. So like Callum said, my name's Prratek. I manage the data engineering team at Vox Media. My talk's called Outgrowing a Single DBT Run, and it's broadly about orchestration patterns for your DBT project as it grows, both in size and complexity. But that's all I'm going to say for this slide, so let's move on. This is me. I figured the way you do introductions at these things is you throw in a collection of facts, so that's exactly what I'm going to do. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I used to tell people I'm kind of into running, but I'm now one of those people who I woke up at 7:30 a.m. to go for a run before this, so I guess I'm really into running now. I studied physics and philosophy in college, got a bachelor's degree, decided I'm not the sort of person to go get a PhD. Ended up here, I guess. And I started as the first data engineer hire on my team, and then we're a team of like 5 engineers today, which is pretty exciting. All right, let's move on to what we're actually going to talk about. And I'm going to start with a loose claim. So some of the terminology here is borrowed from a blog post by folks at Snap Commerce that I've linked to towards the end of the slide deck. But I think it works, so I'm going to use it. I think that schedule-based orchestration, so let's call this proactive orchestration, where you're running your project at some time each day, doesn't quite scale well with your DBT project, and it can lead to some messy consequences that we'll talk about in more detail later in the talk. But some combination of that schedule-based or proactive orchestration combined with sensor-based orchestration, let's call that reactive orchestration, just might work if you pause to think about what your patterns are. So if that felt kind of out of the blue, out of nowhere, here's what we're talking about. I'm going to tell you a story that I think is interesting and led to us adopting DBT. I'll talk a little bit about how our DBT project grew and how our orchestration techniques evolved with that. Then I'll talk about those messy consequences I alluded to, and why proactive orchestration wasn't quite working for a lot of what we wanted to do, and then on to that supposed pattern, right? And right at the end, we'll spend a few seconds on some next steps. Because I'm hoping this is the start of a conversation, and I've seen a fair bit in the community where people are thinking about how and when to orchestrate their projects. So at the end of this, I'll say this again, but if you have ideas, thoughts, questions, in addition to dropping them in Slack, feel free to come find me and say hi. All right, so if you take nothing else away from this, and the rest of the 30 minutes is kind of a lot, here's what I'm going to say, right? My advice is run your staging models as soon as new data arrives in your warehouse. Step 2, once that's done, you have a single DBT run for all of your data marts. That's when you pause, think about whether this gets you to where you need to be with whatever your downstream use cases are. And if it doesn't, there's a little room to get creative. But we'll spend a little more time on each one of these as we go along. But let's start by backing up a little, right? I wanna spend like 30 seconds on what Vox Media is and what we do to give you a sense of the sort of work that I'm doing. So most people familiar with Vox they have a podcast they listen to every morning that's by the Vox Media Network, or you've seen explainer content on our website. But really, Vox Media is a collection of over a dozen editorial brands, all of which are reaching audiences across the web, podcasts. We've done like explainer content on streaming platforms like Netflix and Hulu. There's ad management software that's used by other publishers. So this sort of gives you a sense of the scale of data we're working with, not just in terms of volume, but in terms of the number of possible use cases, right? But that's all I'm going to say about that. And let's back up to what feels like almost a lifetime ago, but now that I think about it, was really like 2019. Right? So this is when I started at New York Magazine, which later became part of Vox. Maybe this looks familiar to some of you. This is what our transformation layer in our stack looked like. We were using Airflow as our orchestrator, my bad, and using something called a BigQuery operator. The idea is pretty simple. You can throw in a SQL query that references certain tables in your warehouse. You can configure a destination table to write that query result to. And then when you run that as part of a pipeline on some schedule, it'll materialize that downstream table in your warehouse. Now, we were doing a fair bit of interesting work then. And this pattern sort of worked for us, but it was hard to scale, right? There's no sense of lineage. Our DAG was essentially one layer deep across the board. It was hard to reuse transformations, and so there was a lot of duplicative code. Queries got a little expensive. Warehouse costs would rise quickly the moment you tried to do more, and you were sort of limited in the sort of questions you can ask because your query complexity could only grow so much, right? So a slightly less long time ago, but still 2019, I was working on a dashboard that we were building in Python. I am now convinced we were over-engineering, but that's a separate story. So I was trying to support, end users who want to filter by a few dimensions, and it's a few KPIs. You want to slice it by a different dimension and re-render the query results, right? Something your BI tool will do for you. But anyway, so I was thinking about how this works with that pattern from the last slide, and it really didn't. Right? For some of these queries to be efficient, we had to pre-aggregate data by a few different dimensions. And so instead of having a bunch of queries that run on a schedule to aggregate each day, I decided maybe we can template some of them. So we were using Jinja templates that we were then rendering to SQL queries. If this sounds familiar to folks in the room, it's because it is. And so, I mean, that was... It was like a month from there to me Googling Jinja plus SQL and seeing a combination of DBT and dialectical behavior therapy somewhere in the search results. Anyway, so let's talk about orchestration like I promised. So it started off pretty simply. I was the only data engineer on the team at that time, like I said. And so I was developing locally, I was running models locally, and it was pretty great, right? Like I'd work on something maybe in a branch, maybe not. Maybe I'd merge something into my main branch in my repo, and we'd push it up to GitHub. But like the way it was being run was I'd log in each morning and I'd issue a dbt run CLI command from my terminal, and that populated a bunch of tables. And I'm not saying this is what you should do, but I'm saying it can actually be a great starting point. And the lesson I would take away from this is don't overcomplicate too early, right? We were able to scale to like 50 models pretty quickly, and I think it worked pretty well. Like I wouldn't do it differently, right? But that also means I don't work on the weekends, so our queries don't run on the weekends. Every now and then. Like if I'm a little tired of work and I take a vacation, so does all of our reporting. So like it doesn't quite work beyond a certain point. So that's when you start thinking about what production quote unquote means to you, right? Those are not our Airflow DAGs. That's from their docs somewhere. But anyway, we were already running Airflow, like I said, so it was pretty simple. Right? You have another pipeline that's just running your DBT project, maybe each morning. And that sort of works. But this is also when we started to realize something that I think a lot of you in the DBT community will see, which is that once you start working with DBT, because you can do more, the teams downstream of you trying to solve business problems are starting to ask more nuanced questions, right? It's not just how many new customers did we acquire today. It's looking at our different acquisition channels, what can you tell me about which of those is giving us customers with better retention, right? So your query complexity grows, lineage gets a little more tricky. And for the most part, we handle that with some combination of additional DBT runs for subsets of our project, because we had certain data sources that came in at different times. Some stuff needed to run at higher frequencies. We started throwing in incremental models. And for the most part, it worked until it didn't, right? I'm going to spend a little bit of time walking through this hypothetical in detail, because even though it's not exactly what happened to us, it's pretty analogous. So say you're interested in studying behavior on some checkout flow, right? That sounds fairly common. And so maybe you've got page view data coming from some web analytics tool or in-app analytics, and those are events streaming to your warehouse or coming in on some schedule. And then you've got information about who converted that's coming from some internal database, right? Maybe because you'd rather go to that source of truth than rely on like client-side event instrumentation. It's a little more reliable. And using those to say, hey, we've got this table of checkouts with really neat metadata about like what your acquisition source was, whether you converted, right? And that's a DBT model. And you're running all of this on different schedules, right? You've thought about it. You've thought about the fact that that ingestion process from that purchases table will finish at a certain time. And as long as that works, your DBT project's running after that in the day, it should work. And so maybe you get more ambitious and you decide we're going to use this for abandoned cart messaging. You start pushing out user metadata to some email platform, and people are using that to send emails saying, hey, look, you left something behind in your cart, right? Now, what happens when that ingestion process from that purchases table fails? What'll happen is, unless you've reasoned about this very carefully, you'll end up with data that's telling you that, at least for that day, none of those users converted. They all abandoned something in their cart. They're all going to get that email. And that's a really bad experience, right? And then if you throw in incremental models into the mix like we had, thinking about how to fix that after the fact can be just as challenging, because you're trying to now go to single partitions in a partition table and replace those single partitions containing bad data with once that's been fixed, something a little more accurate. And it's just a mess, right? So we sort of went back to the drawing board, which for us, we're working in this doc here. It's just like, you're not expected to read that. It's just a screenshot to show you what the process looked like for us, right? We sort of talked about what was going wrong and why, what we needed to do, and tried to translate that into possible different approaches we could take to how we're orchestrating our DBT DAG, given what we knew about it. And we ended up with a couple of requirements. The most important one, right at the top, was that those disconnected cron schedules had to go. That was the biggest cause for concern. We couldn't do that anymore, right? Second, whatever we built had to account for the fact that our data sources have different schedules or frequencies. Maybe this is something you control with like a Fivetran or something. Maybe you've written your own pipelines, but regardless, you can't assume that all data is coming into your warehouse at the same time. And some of those downstream use cases, whether it's a dashboard or those abandoned cart hypothetical emails, can have varying SLAs. This was a little less important for us, but still a factor. A bit of a sidebar while we're on this. Most of the issue with our sources having these different frequencies was, so we're instrumenting tracking on our websites with Google Analytics, and it's about some number of millions of users a day. I don't remember. I don't know how specific I'm allowed to be about that. But anyway, The way that works is you send events to Google Analytics that they will then sessionize and drop into your warehouse sometime between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. the next day. And so everything has to react to that, right? And if you don't, you're in trouble. Okay, so before we talk solutions, I'm making a couple of assumptions that I want to call out. Right? These are not unconventional because, as you'll see on the next slide, it's borrowed from dbt's guidance on how you structure your project. So I'm going to assume you can broadly divide your models into two categories. They're either staging transformations. These map directly to source systems you're getting data from, and it's essentially a model to say, hey, let's do a little cleanup. Right? So maybe you're getting ad campaign metadata from Facebook ads or something, I don't know. And you're saying, let's normalize how we handle null values, maybe rename some columns so that they're all like snake case column names, a couple other things. And so lineage at that stage of your project is pretty simple. And then you've got marts models that are models organized by business area. These might join across multiple sources. They might aggregate. They might do, I don't know what else, but like anything goes at this stage, right? And here's the, not a screenshot, but I copied and pasted this from the dbt docs. You'll see something pretty similar, right? You've got a directory for your marts models, another one for your staging models. And each of those have subdirectories. For staging, it's by source system. For marts, it's by the business area that particular dbt model is for. Okay. So let's go back to this slide I started with. And back then I said my advice was, step one, run all of your staging models as soon as you have new data available for that source. Step two, you've got a single dbt run that's running all of your marts models, in contrast with staging where you'll have one run per source system. And then before you think about further steps, you pause and you think about whether that gets you where you need to be, right? If people don't care that a certain dashboard's being refreshed at noon instead of 10 a.m., this is where you stop, right? Because you don't need the additional complexity. But if you really, really, really do, there are a few options, and I'll sort of walk through some ideas. So let's talk about each of these in a little more detail now. So that first one, right? I think you should treat the process of running a dbt staging model as essentially one of the success criteria for ingesting data into your warehouse. This may not be the case for all of you, but like at least some methods for ingesting data you might be ingesting all historical data each day, and you're appending to a table, you're ending up with duplicates, you haven't thought about the difference between a null and an empty string. So for the most part, that data is just not usable, right? You haven't produced anything of value until you've run a little bit of cleanup and normalization, right? So run that immediately. If you have a data source that's refreshing once an hour, run those staging models once an hour, if possible, as part of the same process, right? And another side note of sorts, you might have heard advice in the dbt community about not doing multiple concurrent runs of your project. Most of that is stemming from the fact that if you're running the same model concurrently through different processes, you can end up in a weird place where you're concurrently writing to the same table. That's not relevant here because we have mutually exclusive model selection rules that will basically look like this, right? So say we're thinking about that same hypothetical Facebook ads data source. We're saying, let's do a dbt run and select just the staging models for that source. Now, there are two ways this might go when you want to actually make it happen. The first possibility is you own the ingestion process. I'm assuming here, if you're in a talk about orchestration, that maybe you're using an orchestration tool or thinking about it. So maybe you've got an extract and load pipeline, right? And you can add a step to that to do that transformation, and you're good to go. Or maybe it's a little more complicated than that, in which case that's when you start thinking about what we called reactive orchestration from before, right? So that same Google Analytics hypothetical, we have the same problem with Google Ads, where it'll show up in the warehouse when it shows up in the warehouse, and the data volume is about 10x the other source because it's ad impression data. And so what you can do is something like this, right? And actually, before that, you can extend this to, it doesn't have to be some unpredictable source that drops into your warehouse at some time, right? It can be an ingestion process that some other team controls, or for whatever reason is outside of your domain of control, and so you can't add a step to that pipeline, right? You can essentially create a sensor to kick off that staging run when a certain condition is met. So this is an incomplete snippet of code from our Dagster code base, right? So you can't copy and paste this and like expect it to work, but broadly what it's doing is this. It's saying, hey, here's a list of tables that correspond to this data source, right? Like we're getting these 3 tables. Can you check when each of those tables has last updated? And if they've all updated within a certain time frame, which in our case was that last line there where you say update, where you see updated within days equals 0. So we're checking if all of those tables have updated today. And if they have, let's kick off the DBT run we talked about. So the actual implementation looks a little different based on your choice of orchestration tool. But the pseudocode sort of remains the same. And we've got some additional logic in there to make sure you're not kicking off multiple runs per day. You can do that with, in Dagster, you can do it with run keys. So if you have multiple runs with the same key, it won't run the next one. But that's just a little bit of detail. All right, so let's pause, right? We've thought about the staging half of our DBT project. Let's actually go back to that so that this is not distracting. Which means a decent chunk of our project is out of the way. That's another little advantage I had listed down there. Once you've gotten these staging runs out of the way, you have far less left to reason about, right? But the bits you do have left to reason about will have far more complex lineage, at least occasionally, right? Because this is when you're joining across sources for that hypothetical checkouts table from a few slides ago. This is when you're doing your fancy window functions and whatever else is sitting in those scary macros you've got in your project. So my advice is when your lineage starts to get complex, that's when you keep your orchestration simple, right? If you have complexity on both fronts, it can be a very difficult developer experience. So what you want to do is you have a single DBT run that's running all of your marts models. It looks something like that. It's a DBT run -- select marts if you've got your project organized in the way we described. And you're getting a couple of other things with this, right? You're also guaranteeing that your entire DBT project is going to run on some base frequency, and it'll happen in a way that if this is reactive, like we'll talk about in a minute, that is safely handling all of those edge cases, right? So what does it mean for this run to be reactive? I said this a couple of times, but what you want is to check to see when all of your staging models have run in your project. And once they have, you kick this one off. That talk sounds like fun. So this is, again, pseudocode, right? We're doing a couple of things. First off, let's list out all of the runs in our orchestration tool that are running DBT staging models. Second, let's check when they last succeeded and see if all of those runs had a successful, if there was a successful run for each of them today. If there was, and you haven't run your yet, that's when you kick it off, right? So let's pause, because we've done a lot, right? We've given ourselves virtually immediate access to clean, deduplicated staging data as soon as it's available. We've guaranteed that the rest of our project will run on some low guarantee of freshness, regardless of when those sources are coming in. For most of you, this will typically be once a day. And we've done a couple of other things, right? We've guaranteed that we don't have cron schedules to coordinate, which is pretty great, which makes it easy to extend to a variety of data sources, because we talked about how that bit of your project can be reactive. And we've talked about how to safely navigate some of the potential headaches you might have that we outlined earlier in the presentation. But we've also paid a price for this. We've got more DBT runs, but if you've got an orchestration tool you're using, this should be okay. There's some occasionally tricky sensor logic, which is upfront work. But once you get that out of the way, for the most part, the sensor pattern is the same from one usage to the next. You've got a single point of failure for all of your marts models, right? But if you had a single run for your whole project, this is not new. And then the freshness of those marts is dictated by your slowest data source, which is not great, but it's an improvement over potentially running those marts before that source was available. And like I said, let's stay on this. This is where you pause, because if that's good enough for you, that's a great stopping point. It's where we stopped for a little bit. But if you truly have use cases downstream that need fresher data and can't get that from your staging tables, you'll realize that we haven't really addressed the fact that like some of those marts models have use cases with more strict SLAs, right? So like I said, this is when you can get a little creative and you have a couple of options. And I'll run through them very briefly. The simplest one is you just add in additional runs to run subsets of your DBT DAG, right? You can say, hey, let's run these 5 models that I need for this dashboard that has to be refreshed at 9 a.m. because someone's waking up early and looking at it. The second option, which is a little more complex, is you can extend the same pattern from your marts, right? Instead of checking to see if all your staging runs have completed before kicking off your marts, you can have a single data mart that's downstream of 2 sources. And so you can use the same sensor logic, but to check for 2 jobs that are running just those staging models before kicking it off. And the last one's sort of a vague idea where it's something we're trying out, and I will at some point write a blog post on it when we get there, but you can combine a few sort of newer abstractions from tools we happen to be using to essentially get you to a place where you can tell your orchestration tool, hey, we've got these 3 models that are used in this dashboard, right? Now I'm going to let you figure out what DBT models are upstream of that, what staging models are upstream of that. Check to see when those staging models have run, and when they have, let's kick off the marts models needed for that DBT exposure, right? Which gets you to a pretty solid place, but that's complex to implement, so get there if you need to. And that's basically all I'm going to cover. But I want to finish with a closing thought, right? We've talked about a fair bit, but there are some broader principles at play. I think that a successful orchestration pattern for DBT has to navigate the fact that there's this tension between your upstream systems that are placing freshness constraints on what you can do with your data and when. And then there are downstream users or use cases that are demanding certain freshness SLAs. And learning how to navigate that is key to doing this well. I threw in a list of recommended readings, and right at the end there, I put myself on the spot so that I do actually write that blog post. But the idea is I'm going to try and put something out there with more practical code samples for those of you who are doing this with the same tools that we're using. So look out for that in a few weeks. And like I said, if you have ideas or thoughts, come talk to me. Or better yet, write about it, because then you'll reach a wider audience. But yeah, that's all I got for you. Thank you.
Let's give it up for a great talk. So if any of you have questions, please go to the Coalesce Outgrowing a Single channel on DBT Slack. Prratek will be available for about an hour after answering questions on Slack. You can probably also find him around here. Thank you all for joining with us. And if you are interested, there's a following talk in about 11 minutes in this room on how to build your data team like a community. If you're interested in sticking around for that, please do. Otherwise, please go out and enjoy the rest of the talks. And thank you everyone for joining us both in person and online. Have a great day.